My name is Rich Kilmer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And let me add my welcome to those from the other folks who gave them. Thank you so much for being a part of what is obviously a very important discussion. And this is an opportunity to dig deep into Catholic thought and theology, into the wonderful teachings and moral traditions of the Roman Catholic Church. So thank you for being a part of this and for helping to dig deeply into it. I just want to say a couple things about real program that everybody in this room and everybody attending this conference can be a part of. You were given a packet of programmatic materials when you came in, and I'm going to ask you to look at that right now and to take out two items. One is called the 2009 Agenda for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. You'll recognize it because there's a check mark by number 1. There's 5 items on it, and there's a red check mark. You can't miss that one. And then the other one is a petition statement that is called a statement on a commission of inquiry. Let me start with that one. The National Religious Campaign Against Torture believes that my grandchildren ought to grow up in a country that does not torture. And that 20 years from now, my grandkids could say, you know what, our country used to torture, but we don't do that anymore. So the question is, how do we create that country? And a major way to do that is to put into effect safeguards that will prevent what happened from happening again. Now, how do we know what those safeguards should be? Well, the one way to know what those safeguards should be is to investigate what happened, to find out what happened, who was tortured, by whom, for what effect, what were the laws, what was the culture that was going on in the White House that allowed that to happen. We have a lot to learn. And we need to learn it in order to make sure that my grandkids can grow up in a country that does not torture. We are working hard in a variety of ways to get either the President or the Congress to create a commission of inquiry. And we invite you to join us. As you can see, the form that you have is a petition that you can sign. And my colleague, Karen Batayoff, has copies here, and she'll pass that through you, through the audience. And I hope you will join us today and also when you go home to get lots of folks in your parishes and in your religious organizations to join us in the effort for a commission of inquiry. And then second, let me just go back to the agenda. There's 5 items there. Steve Kalecki talked about 4 and 5, and they're all very, very important. I just want to say thank you to everybody for number 1. And number 1 was the President of the United States issued an executive order halting torture. And that came because Roman Catholics joining Protestants and joining Jews and joining Muslims and joining evangelicals and joining lots of other people held hands and was a very strong religious voice to urge the president-elect at that point and then the president to issue an executive order ending torture. We have other tasks that are on that list that we believe need to happen in 2009. It's a lot of work. 5 bills we've got to pass this year. So I'm asking you all to join us again to do the same kind of energetic work that you did in 2008. And let's end torture once and for all. Thank you. Now, let me introduce my good friend Marie Dennis, who is the director of the Maryknoll Office for Governmental Affairs here in Washington, D.C., who will be the moderator for this next panel. Marie?
Thank you, Rich, and good afternoon, everyone. As you know, the next panel will be on the topic of peace building and torture. How can we build a just peace in light of the use of torture in conflict situations? Just war theory offers guidance on ad bellum and in bellum policy and behavior. But the emerging concern within the just war theory is about obligations after the war to construct a just peace. How can this obligation be met in conflict situations where torture was used as an instrument of war? Our panel will address that topic, and in our conversations, hopefully we will expand it a bit to think about what the Catholic tradition, nonviolence tradition, and pacifist traditions might also bring to this conversation. Each of our panelists, two are here, and Professor Doug Cassell is on his way. He flew out of South Bend, Indiana this morning and got caught in the rain somewhere. He's supposedly landed at 3:30 and should be here before the end of this panel. Each of our panelists brings rich experience to what is a very challenging topic, experience that is deeply rooted in the horrific reality of torture and egregious violations of human rights, and set in a clear moral and ethical framework. But I am intensely aware of a very significant shortcoming in the formal composition of our panels this afternoon. Was alluded to, I'm very happy to say, by Father Christensen right before we broke, and that is the absence of a survivor of torture on our program. I was very happy that at least those who are here who are survivors were acknowledged. But my own life has been touched very deeply by the courage and the stories of torture survivors from around the world. And I fault myself as failing to have insisted that a survivor of torture be on one of the formal panels. There is nothing that replaces or can speak from the experience of torture the way those who have endured torture can do. I think this is a very familiar scene, one that years ago I promised I would never allow to happen, and I did this time. So great, deep apologies to those survivors who are here, and we are delighted that you're here and hope that you will engage in the conversation in ways that are comfortable for you. I believe that what for many of us is an issue is painful beyond words. And these women and men have struggled with enormous courage and dedication through TASC, the Torture Abolition and Survivor Support Coalition, and other organizations to bring to an end this horrendous practice worldwide. While we began to move in the direction of addressing torture visible in the United States practices, our friends who are survivors of torture from around the world have been addressing this concern for years, and we are grateful that you're here and apologize that you're not on a formal panel. It's my privilege first to introduce to you Dr. Mary Fabry, who is the Senior Director of Torture Treatment Services and International Training at the Heartland Alliance Marjorie Kovler Center in Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Fabry has devoted her career to working in the public sector, including previous positions as staff psychologist at Cook County Hospital and as program director for the Bosnian Mental Health Program and the Refugee Mental Health Training Program, both at Heartland Alliance. Mary provides national and international training and consultation on issues of torture and severe trauma. She is currently working regularly in East Africa, in Rwanda, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, training health providers on the long-term consequences of trauma and implications for treatment. Dr. Fabry is also training Kurdish and Arab healthcare providers at the Kovler Center, through the Kovler Center in northern Iraq. She has worked as a consultant in Guatemala and in Haiti and has published widely on this subject. There are very few people who have the kind of deep experience that Mary has in accompanying survivors of torture and egregious human rights violations in the aftermath of war and violence in country after country. Welcome, Mary.
I'm not used to standing behind a microphone. I'm used to walking, so I'll do my best to stand here. I wanted to start by just having us all think about a quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So I think at this point in time in our country's history, we have an opportunity to face something that has been very integral in our history, and that's the issue of torture. I really was supposed to be speaking after Doug Castle and was hoping that he would give context to some of my comments. And since he's not here, I'm going to refer back to the first panel, who I also think has given context to some of my panels, to my comments. And it is around the issues of accountability and responsibility, not only for us as individual Americans, but for those of us who have professional alliances, like myself as a clinical psychologist, the American Psychological Association, lawyers, our government officials. We all have our professional affiliations as well. And I also think as an American citizen in traveling around the world, I had a real eye-opening experience. It was an aha experience, taking taxis from airports to hotels, and I was in Amman, Jordan, and feeling a little embarrassed about being an American in a car with an Arab, a Muslim Arab, and wondering, knowing the inevitable question that I would be asked is, where are you from? And saying the United States, and he looked at me and said, that's okay. And I looked at him sort of surprised, and his response was, oh, we understand the American people are not represented by their government. And it was really an aha moment for me. Growing up in the 50s, being educated in parochial school, being taught about government by representation and the importance of voting, and suddenly realizing my government doesn't represent me. The system has failed me. As an American citizen, my government was failing me. As a psychologist, my professional organization has failed me. The American Psychological Association does not represent a large number of their members' views on issues like torture. In 2005, it became public that psychologists were working with the U.S. military and the CIA to develop interrogation techniques, enhanced interrogation techniques, which constitute torture. In response to that becoming public, APA formed a task force called Psychological Ethics and National Security Force Task Force, PENS. And in 2 days, a weekend of meeting, this group came up with a document and determined that psychologists were playing a valuable and ethical role by advising the military and CIA, and that they could do so in a responsible way and need to remain involved. Later, it was learned that 6 out of the 9 members of the PENS were from military and intelligence agencies with direct connections to Guantanamo and the CIA black site interrogations. This created an uproar in the members. And again, there's a schism. It was referenced that there's a schism in the church. There's a schism in, civil society. There's a schism in my professional organization as well. I, being in Washington, D.C. for June 26th, took the opportunity to meet with the Director of Ethics of APA with one of my colleagues from the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs. and one member of the PENS task force. And we expressed our concerns as clinical psychologists working in the rehabilitation of torture survivors about our colleagues being involved in any way. Some of you may or may not know that in August of 2007, at the annual meeting of APA, there was a town meeting in which there was very fiery, challenging, impassioned dialogue about how we conduct ourselves as psychologists, and a firm belief that psychology is a science and a profession that is to promote health and well-being and education. And therefore, psychologists should not be involved in settings where there are detainees being deprived of their basic human rights. This was ignored by the governing body of APA. And I want to bring this up because I think in a parallel process, any actions that I took as a citizen within the avenues presented to me within my government, talking to my congressmen, senators and representatives, signing petitions, making phone calls, were ignored by elected officials. So I think one of the things that happens in torture, it renders people helpless. And I really encourage us to look at this problem of torture in a systemic way. Because if an individual in their homeland is tortured, that individual is not in isolation in some cell being tortured. That individual belongs to a family, and whether they return to their family or not, that family is impacted by the event of torture. That family exists in a community, and that community adjusts itself. Are they afraid to affiliate with that family because a torture victim or survivor was a member? How does the family adjust themselves to interacting with each other after this kind of event? How does larger society align itself? And I think that's one of the things we are struggling with right now. How are we going to align ourselves with the knowledge that our government has tortured? Our names have been involved in this kind of an activity. I also want to tell you that as part of actions that we took in Chicago, and I work at a torture treatment center that has been around for 22 years. We have a long experience of working with survivors from over 72 different countries have come through our doors. Because of our wish to try and bring some action into our profession around this issue of psychologists being involved in torture, we invited the director of ethics, who I had met a year previously with no sense of response other than I was met with, to come to Kovler. And he did. He came to Kovler Center and met with 30 clinical psychologists who are part of our network of working with survivors of torture. And nothing came out of it. I want to start with that. I mean, we had a very interesting, impassioned discussion. But what I wanted to say is at the end, amidst all the frustration of meeting with someone who essentially is a public relations person, even though he's an attorney and psychologist, he was really the American Psychological Association's public relation person on this issue of torture, and was going all over the place meeting with people in the effort to appear as if our voices were being heard. But when you see what happened at APA, there still is not an unequivocal stance against psychologists being involved in some direct or indirect way in torture. So I just want to say that that is sort of the issue of having silence Even though you exercise your voice, there is silence. But our closing comment to him was a really strong wish by all of us that if people could understand, if all the psychologists in the American Psychological Association, if other civilians, if our communities could understand what the long-term consequences of torture are, then everyone would agree that torture is wrong. Unequivocally, torture is wrong because of what it does. And the break with having a sense of integrity, dignity, and morality for all of us, for the survivor, for the perpetrator, and for all of us, for the family, the community, the larger society. There's no way around that. We have all had our morality, ethics, and dignities compromised by the use of torture. Now, I want to back up some of what I'm saying by research that I've been involved with in the last 5 years, and talk a little bit about the long-term consequences of what torture does. You know, in the moment, we're given this argument that it provides information of, import to national security. But I think the question that was posed earlier is, was a very good question. If torture works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't, but if it works sometimes, is it worth using? That's a very good question, because that's not the question. The question is about torture being wrong, torture being an issue of morality, dignity, and ethics. And that we don't want to go there. Because what we're creating through the use of torture are individuals whose lives have been altered and will be altered for the rest of their lives. Their course of profession, of life goals, is going to be turned around and heading in a different direction. I want to share with you that in May 2005, 11 years after the genocide in Rwanda, I was able to help pull together a research project where we interviewed 850 women. Some were HIV positive, some were HIV negative. Half of them had the experience of being raped. All were in Rwanda during the genocide. Now, some of you might say, well, that was genocide. That was a horrific experience. But what we have to understand is that genocide occurred in the context of war, that a war was going on, there was civil conflict, and yes, the genocide occurred, but individuals were tortured in the context of that genocide. And what we learned from this study was that 11 years, so in 2005, 11 years after the genocide, 850 women were interviewed. 78% of them were reporting symptoms of depression. 60% of them met the criteria for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. 94% of them reported that they lived under conditions of war for an extended period. 82% reported that for extended periods they had no food or water for themselves or their family. 75% said they had no access to medical care. 71% reported that they lost families and family members and friends, that they had been killed. And 65% of them were displaced from their homes. These are conditions of the genocide, but these are conditions of war. And these are conditions in which torture takes place, where individuals are identified and arrested and detained and tortured. So if you think about it, 11 years, I'm still working in Rwanda. The depression symptoms are still up there. We've managed through intervention to alleviate some of the post-traumatic stress symptoms, but the depression we're not really having much impact on. And I think some of that has to do with post-conflict conditions of poverty. And, you know, if you got up every day and didn't know how you were going to feed your family, and if you didn't know if your child with HIV was going to access care, you'd feel depressed too. I mean, I think post-conflict conditions, if you read literature, it takes 3 generations for a country to pull itself back together. Many countries don't get 3 generations before there's another conflict. So we're looking at conditions which promote poor well-being, poor mental health, poor conditions of survival. In some countries where poverty isn't that issue, like I've been working in northern Kurdistan, and we've started a torture treatment center there. And from January 2008 till December 2008, we saw 130 torture survivors. Many were Kurds who had been tortured 20 years previously under the regime of Saddam Hussein. Some were referrals through the United Nations UNAMI AIDS mission to Iraq, referred from Baghdad up to us in Kurdistan. There was a very recognizable difference between the two. And if any of you are familiar with Kurdistan, it's northern Iraq, and it's been stable. It's not poor. People have jobs. They're well fed. But what we saw in doing assessments of this 130 people that were Kurds was that their quality of life, the levels of depression were huge. People had gotten married. People had children. They were employed. But there's a huge issue of domestic violence, severe disciplinary behavior towards children, and just a lack of enjoyment. So what we see is that this kind of maltreatment results in long-term depression, which impacts quality of life. And so when we think about how can we prevent this, is we have to find alternative ways to get information we need, not torture, to resolve conflicts other than war. I mean, this is sort of an idealistic view, but I'm just going to throw it out there because I think there is an opportunity at this point in time to bring people together to talk about it. And as I look at what these long-term consequences are, people's realities are changed, right? They lose their ability to regulate their emotions because anger comes up much quicker, depression comes down much quicker. They view themselves differently because the most horrible thing has happened to them. They've been tortured. And the thing that's important for all us to remember is that torture happens within the context of a relationship. It's a perverse relationship, but there are 2 people. It involves human contact. So when we go back out in the world, that experience of what humans can do to each other goes with the survivor, just as our experience of growing up in a family goes with us. You know, it's like our experience of human relationship goes with us, and torture is part of being involved in a perverse human relationship. So in terms of the question, I just want to give this broad context of how people are changed. The victims and survivors of torture are changed, their families are changed, their communities are changed, the larger society is changed. That includes us. And I think the first panel addressed a lot of the changes that we've experienced in our own culture, our own society. The good news is society is dynamic and fluid, and it can change again. and more. But as I look at thoughts about how to build peace after conflict, and I know in the legal community, truth commissions, in the human rights community, truth commissions always comes up. Truth commissions. Have people say what they did. Good thing, document what happened. But I strongly feel, given the context of my experience of working with survivors, it's not enough. If you look to South Africa as one example, the issue that I see that is wrong is that the exact people who sat and listened to the testimonies of what was done to their loved ones go back and live in a shanty town and don't know how they're going to support their families. The conditions of post-conflict are not addressed through truth commissions. That's one piece of it. But as we talked in the first panel, and I think we're going to hear more about, the ethics and the morality and the integrity of how can we reinstitute human dignity when there are conditions where people are not able to feel moral and ethical themselves because they can't carry out their own tasks of daily life, which is being a good parent, being a good student, being a good spouse, being a good community leader, because you don't have the opportunity to support on a daily basis by feeding, by working, by having the kinds of interactions that build healthy relationships. So I know this is sort of a different perspective, and I'm coming at it from sort of a on-the-ground, hands-on person. And it's the observations I've made, and it's what I've taken away from 22 years of working with torture survivors about what they need. And it very much is to have a good, healthy relationship with another human being, to have experiences of being respected and being treated with dignity. And if you think about how we all get that in our daily lives, it's by feeling productive, by having employment and providing for our families, and by having an opportunity to engage in civil society in ways that have meaning. And I think that is so much what is needed as we look ahead to what we can do in our society and as we look to peace building in post-conflict societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I am struck by your description of the long-term consequences of torture and terrible violence, what it does to individuals, but also families and communities and a whole society. And I hope that we'll have a chance to talk a bit about what then are the implications for society as a whole. What are the implications, for example, for the United States in the wake of torture that we perpetrated as we look at the task of reconstruction post-conflict, for example, in Iraq. We'll definitely come back to some of that. Second panelist is Dr. George Lopez, who is a founding faculty member of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame, Indiana. George came to Notre Dame in 1986. His research focuses on the problems of state violence and coercion, especially economic sanctions, gross violations of human rights, terrorism and ethics, and the use of force. He has published in a wide range of social science and policy journals on these themes, and I know many of us have read his writings and heard him speak and know of his skill in this area. George has been a frequent commentator in the public square on ethical issues regarding the use of force and the so-called war on terror, especially on radio and television. He has written numerous articles for Commonweal, America, Sojourners, and many newspapers on this topic. Thank you very much for being with us, George.
Thanks very much. The immorality and illegality of torture, no matter what the context or situation, is unquestionable. I'm sure there's no one among us who disagrees with that. There's no one among a larger population that disagrees with that. Why then does torture occur with such regularity? Why are folks like Mary and her colleagues dealing with torture victims from so many countries over a multi-decade span? We have a dilemma in our country, the United States, that we're tempted to examine Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and illegal renditions as a kind of grotesqueness of the moment and a kind of aberration for which they are not. Those of us, to use Peggy's phrase, of a certain age in this room, knew well and participated in Amnesty USA's campaign against torture in the 80s, to the point at which one of our central texts was a very large volume detailing torture throughout the world. There, the focus wasn't the United States, it's how to straighten out instead the Guatemalans and the Argentinians, although the very important linkage, one of which was addressed in a question that was not addressed in the earlier panel, of the thinking that came from the dominant Western power. That linkage wasn't addressed. Peggy raised the question this morning of the ticking time bomb. As an academic, that comes to us in a very particular way. It's not strange that Henry would raise this, because this is the ultimate philosophy 101 question. But the ticking time bomb of the current television discussion and culture is different than what's happened to generation after generation of American in philosophy 101. Because the question becomes, play out the scenario of the ticking time bomb, and what the philosophy professor says to the students, now faced with this dilemma, who among you would not choose torture as a way to save the many thousands? And already squirmy sophomores look at their shoes and can't come up with anything other than, I think I'll choose an ethic that'll protect the innocent. So I guess I would, in this extraordinary situation, use torture. One of the reasons I believe that torture occurs again and again from culture to culture, but has now come much more manifest and clear in our own political order over the last decade, is that many of us need a logic by which we can save the innocents under conditions of running out of more creative and what seem to be, at the outset, futile strategies for protecting the innocent. And when push comes to shove, as it does when you have revelations like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, then we'll admit that we're persuaded by a certain kind of logic given to us by civil and military authorities, that the logic is close enough to a rationale that in this extraordinary circumstance and in this moment, under certain controlled conditions, I'm willing to tolerate torture. Let me emphasize that again. Under certain critical conditions, given this extraordinary time, this unique threat, and this unique moment, I'm willing to tolerate torture. That's why the data suggests why Catholics supported this in large number, as well as many of our fellow citizens. Many in this room, as in my situation, looked at the dynamic that was developing in our country after 9/11 and said, maybe it's time to really hit the road in the public square. I did a lot of public speaking, and for about 3 years, in the context of talking about a so-called war on terror or the need for it, I didn't miss an opportunity to ask of an audience, whether they were 2 people or 200, now who among you tonight doesn't know in your mind and in your gut that somewhere in this world people are being tortured by our country for the information we believe they have? Who among us doesn't know that? And over the course of what must have been about 80 speaking engagements, what did we find? We all knew it. Then I'd read the quote from Jacobo Timerman, the great Argentinian journalist who was captured and tortured in his own country, who returned to Argentina after the end of military rule. And he asked the question in a poignant Sunday New York Times Magazine article, like in Germany in 1945, those of us in Argentina in the early 80s are asking why and how this happened. How is it possible so many of our country people knew and did nothing? As a social scientist, I ask that question, why and why do nothing? And I believe that it's because we've been captivated by a powerful set of doctrines and operational logic, which national government, our own in this case, and their agents formulate in order to make acceptable, justifiable, and actually quite necessary the dynamic of torture. Yes, we have Mr. Wu and the rewriting of the guidelines, but that's a procedural outcome of the larger doctrine that I want to examine for a moment. And I want to examine and try to deconstruct that doctrine because I believe that the prospects for peaceful transition and healing and solidarity and serious peace building in societies, not to mention our own obligation in the societies Marie mentioned in the introduction, the two primary ones where we have been the perpetrators of torture in Afghanistan and Iraq, those things are impossible in a post-violence order unless we understand the logic and rationale which has driven them from the start. Some of us would look to more than 30 years ago when Herb Kelman told us that there's a social psychology to torture and mass killing which demands three particular conditions. The first and most important is a dehumanization of the potential victim. Human beings don't torture human beings, but a human being may need to torture someone less than human, or whose behavior is demonstrably less than human. That dynamic of dehumanization is a first critical step. A second is to free the individual who's to do and approve and develop the mechanisms of torture from the restraints we normally have that would keep us as decent human beings from doing this. I need to be authorized. Not in the form of orders from on high, but that which is terrible, which under most conditions you would not do, now is not just permitted, it's legitimized. It is, in fact, that which would be seen strange and illegal is now, in this moment in time, necessary and usual. It's legitimated and authorized from above. And finally, most critically, as people like the Nazis learned very, very well, what you want to do is you want to routinize the process. You want to make it such that it is a rather regular and usual pattern, not only for the torturer, but as we saw in our own system when this became exposed, there's a routinization that moves from bottom to top through media and the like. It encourages sanitized language. It encourages dissent about how terrible really were the events and how widespread was it. It's the ability of a Secretary of Defense to call the discovery of this the action of a few bad apples. All of this serves the routinization function. Those of us, and I know there are many in this room that spent their time concerned about human rights issues and these kinds of things in Latin America from the 60s on, know well that this was taken to a new level. The development of national security ideology and the dirty wars in Central America and in the ABC countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. I spent a good deal of time studying that myself in the 70s and 80s, another reason why I thought the question was well posed in our prior session. It may have been that technique at all times wasn't taught at the School of the Americas, but it gave people the Bible of the national security doctrine of how to conduct the dirty war. And what was that doctrine? Very, very important. Component one, Those there who would challenge the state represent a cancer on our society. The role cast to us in the armed forces, said the Argentine generals, was to perform the necessary surgical procedures on the society to purge the body politic and eliminate, however painful this must be, those terrible and destructive cancer cells. Second point, not unlike chemotherapy, under conditions of real cancer treatment, we're not surprised to see that the effect of this on the body politic will occasionally have its own levels of pain and destruction. This is the kind of thing that happens when you're dealing with such a serious threat, a threat that may, in the end, if it's allowed to flourish, might exterminate the system. You have to deal with the cancer. And, of course, very, very important component number 3 of the national security doctrine, in the course of dealing with this cancer in this terrible and unique way, we're not surprised that we have to take extraordinary circumstances and situations like suspending civil liberties now in order to absolutely guarantee that they'll operate in the post-dirty wartime. The means justifies the ends. Why were there people in either Argentina or in the American system in the last decade who engaged in the use of torture? Because of the way we characterize the uniqueness of the moment we find ourselves and our ability to portray the other as a singular enemy who cannot be dealt with otherwise. I would submit for our consideration that in a post-9/11 world, the government and then the media and then many other sectors of American society said to us, and we accepted, that the threat and dynamic of this new terrorism, which aims to be so lethal and is driven by such tight ideology and religious fervor that it sanctions issues like and practices like massive suicide bombing. This threat is so severe, so unprecedented, and so crazy that those who perpetrate it defy human logic. Leave an opening, of course, for therefore they must be less than human. Thus proceeds this line of thinking. It's very important to understand that this terrorism needs to be tackled with something that's equally different from past types of terrorism. This is not a criminal problem, this is war, because you and I in American society are hanging by a thread in face of this massive, irrational onslaught. Certainly, we will try to maintain as high standards as we can in the law of war. But our ultimate goal is to defend the thousands and thousands of innocents who are likely to be victims of these mass murderers unless they're dealt with summarily. And the longer that the ashes smoldered in downtown New York, the more that logic took hold. Chief among the understandings that we then accepted in society is that we face a threat from such terrorists that when we look at where do they come from and who are they, we find out that they receive the blessings and support of their local kin and their communities. That the spread of jihadism occurs in village after village, city after city. And what do they want? They want, in fact, to build a caliphate that goes all the way from northern Africa through Islamabad. Thus, how do you confront this kind of enemy? Well, you're not just dealing with the perpetrator, but you've got to deal with the communities in which they live, however distant they may be, because a large support structure of friends, family, and distant others make this terror possible. In the back of a number of people's minds who regularly followed counter-terrorist operations was also, maybe the Israelis don't have it so wrong when they bulldoze people's houses, finding out where did that suicide bomber come from. Maybe that's the way it should be done. The logic, I think, that sustained this kind of torture says that as we confronted the other after 9/11, particularly jihadist extremism, we said that none of these communities failed to generate these terrorists, These communities are supporters, and everybody in the community knows who these people are. That kind of common knowledge must be dealt with, and the support structures must be dealt with. So how can you justify that by early 2004, there were 37,000 people imprisoned in Iraq as suspected terrorists or insurgents? You justify it, and you can engage in terror against many of them because not only have you dehumanized them and routinized the process of bringing them in, but your operative behavior in these detention centers are that these people have a particular communal experience and a particular set of preferences. Fanatical religious beliefs and a commitment to their martyrdom means that they forfeited the real right of guarantees that normal prisoners of war would have. They're not acting as individual soldiers, they're acting as a community cancer that doesn't deserve humane treatment. More essentially, in a tactical sense, then, torture by an occupying force like the United States is an equalizer of some import. Quite possibly the only technique you have as an occupying army to gain advantage over the communal support structure and the ideology that drives this kind of irrational suicide jihadist. It's a functional equivalent to coming up with radar jamming or the Gatling gun. Why is it useful or in fact necessary under these conditions to torture? First, because everyone we arrest in these communities knows something or someone who's a terrorist. Torture will find that out. So yes, the information gathering myth is the first issue, and it dominates, despite the empirical data to the contrary. Secondly, beyond gathering information, we must, on each individual, break their sympathy, support, or even their feeling to need any longer to be related to these community members who are terrorists. Let's use torture to spark them into denial, betrayal, and condemnation. Thirdly, torture in and of itself is a very, very important punishment. We may, in fact, not for the victim discover what this individual has done in the past. We may not have an act of commission to punish. But the odds are they did something. So we're not off base in the use of techniques. And more importantly, we're trying to create new conditions in this wider counter-terrorist environment. And punishment is a critical option for us. Because even without proof or without confession that the individual did anything to support terrorism, this is an individual who lived in a community where terrorism was fermenting, where people were being trained. And what did that individual before us do? They did nothing. Their sin was not commission, it was omission. Thus, interrogation and torture deals with that in a very important way. And why are the psychologists and doctors there? Finally, because it's very important that the victim not die. It's very important, in fact, to turn the victim back to the community in which they come, bruised and broken by torture, because consistent with the torture logic, their entire community should know that the same treatment follows if they do not start to be proactive to deal with the insurgents and terrorists in their midst. They too will be picked up in the dead of night. They too will be tortured, not for their guilt by association, but by the guilt that they're a member of a community. I call this process, as it's unfolded in Iraq and Afghanistan, the new torture paradigm. For those of you who think that this portrayal or logic is a bit overstated or too jaded, or taking argument too far in a particular ideological direction, let me really make you angry. What makes the new torture paradigm possible, I believe, is that it is a derivative of what I would call the new killing paradigm, which has become the norm of military operation in the counterterrorism of the past decade. In fact, it may have begun with the first Gulf War and the U.S. decision to dramatically reduce the civilian infrastructure that sustained Baghdad back to the 18th century. in the kind of bombing that we chose in that particular war. Air and ground attacks wrapped in the language of military necessity have resulted in a disproportionate number of civilian deaths, which civilian and military authorities continue to tell us are regrettable but inevitable, because the immoral, illegal, or less than human enemy hides among the population, using, at its worst, the population as shields, and therefore leaving us in the counter-fighting position with no choice but to attack civilian centers. The Russians, of course, made their own brutal and disjointed version of this, operate in Chechnya in 94-95. Shock and Awe was designed to do this in March of 2003, but didn't have to because of the unique command of the skies and the disappearance of the Iraqi military. But we saw it in spades in the siege of Fallujah in November of 2004. And the Israelis perfected it first in Lebanon in 2006 and more recently in Gaza. After these kinds of events, the lawyers and others scream war crimes. Yes, that's the case. But the problem with focusing simply on war crimes is it misses the larger normative framework which is developed to sustain this incredible attack on civilians. Central to each of these military campaigns is the unspoken logic that if the civilian population has terrorists and insurgents living among them, these enemies have probably attracted numerous sympathizers and potential recruits within that community. So an attack to eradicate the embedded terrorists in densely populated areas may not need to be as careful and surgical as military rubric would normally determine. In fact, widespread attacks that destroy a number of civilian-based infrastructure targets impose high costs in life and property on a lot of sympathizers. The war, this logic proceeds, is one where local people, in fact, should pay a price for their unwillingness to purge their community of the terrorists and insurgents. Attacks like the Gaza incursion send a signal to an innocent population that you have choices to make. You're either going to deal with the terrorists among you or we will deal with them. What does that mean for those of us in this room who abhor torture and the killing of innocent civilians in war? Well, it means that this style of warfighting, the new killing paradigm, and its associated, the new torture paradigm, render our traditional categories as ethicists of collateral damage or innocent civilians relatively meaningless, because the perpetrators of these acts have already made a determination that these innocents who have terrorists living among them forfeited their civilian immunity by not purging the terrorists from their midst. Whether you believe that there are prohibitions that get violated, or there's presumptions against the use of force that needs to be argued, or you teach or think or write about principles of proportionality, civilian immunity, or even military necessity, the truth, I believe, is that these two doctrines and practices on torture and killing have shaken us to our knees to render these categories no longer meaningful. We have one of the greatest ethical challenges we've ever faced. Decision makers who sanctioned torture did not slip down some slippery slope or lose their focus in the fog of war. They weren't trying to make their best prudential judgments under unprecedented circumstances. In fact, they developed a set of principles of action and followed it to the T as a particular warfighting strategy in a world in which there can be no innocent civilians. I do indeed hope that the Catholic social teaching that Steve spoke so eloquently about this morning could in fact be a powerful alternative paradigm. But I worry greatly about its strength, especially when the bishops of which we argued about this morning are unwilling to tell every Catholic prelate to preach that from the pulpit on any given Sunday. Almost 26 years ago, the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, in a quite different mode, got together and wrote one of the great visionary documents of our time on the challenge of peace. They gave strictly conditioned moral acceptance to deterrence. Some of us looking at that process are a little bit more on the side of Gordon Zahn. We would have preferred the phrase deferred condemnation rather than strictly conditioned moral acceptance. But how is it possible that with that strong statement against the dramatic killing of civilians in that era, we haven't made as strong a strictly conditioned moral acceptance to a particular aspect of torture and this warfighting doctrine? I've been asked to say, what's the implications of this for peace building? Let me close with that, because the peace building in Gaza, Iraq, and Afghanistan requires a great deal of attention beyond which I'll give my time to, but I can list 8 particular dynamics we have to begin with. The first jumps off Mary's good comments earlier. My understanding of strategic peace building and the prospects for recovery of community is that you need multiple generations of detailed, serious work on this problem. For too long in the praxis of peace building, we believe that signing a peace accord and the fighting factions going to demilitarization solve the problems. What could possibly make us believe that 20 years of civil war wouldn't demand 20 to 30 years of civil healing and a regeneration of a different version of social change other than through the barrel of a gun? So the first rubric is, this is a lifetime commitment, and for those like our own society, which has fractured others like Iraq, it needs to be a 20 or 30-year commitment to fulfill certain moral obligations. Secondly, all successful peace building that I know of is always a coalition of insiders and outsiders. Therefore, people like Mary are, in fact, doing the global work that needs to be done in mobilizing and working with locals. That item of solidarity, so critical to Catholic social thinking, has to become an important governmental policy for the rebuilding of societies. Whether this be at the trauma healing level or the rewriting of 7th grade textbooks, which purge from that community the stereotypes of hatred that led to dehumanization. It means as well a continual commitment by the outsiders like ourselves to recognize the role we've played in that kind of torture and to redo it. To admit failure, to admit succumbing to this temptation, and to reject this new paradigm. Because this new paradigm, thirdly, focuses so much on the destruction of communities, the reconstruction of community must be, not just of the individual, but the reconstruction of the community in which they thrive must be part of the plan. Fourth, as the people of Chile and Liberia have shown us, you may need to elect former victims and those who were former targets of these bad rulers as your leaders, because more than any other, they understand the historical and psychological and collective saga you've been through. Fifth, as Jacobo Timmerman warned us, you better continually ask why, and how were there people here who knew, who said nothing? Consistent with the good document out of the Bishops' Conference and the curriculum, sixth, I think we've got to change the language, we've got to change the meaning of the language, and we've got to challenge the culture, which seventh imposes a good deal of burden on those of us in this room, because we got to this point because the people of the robes failed us. The robes in the courts, the robes in the pulpits, and the robes in academic garbs. We knew better. We could say it better. We should have taught it better, and we didn't. And finally, and there's no way around this, you cannot have systematic peace and systematic peace building in terrorized societies or among perpetrators of terror unless you have a completely new doctrine about warfighting and the relationship between civilians and military and the obligations after war. Thank you.
Thank you, George. It looks as though Doug Cassell is not yet with us, so he will move to the to the panel after dinner, I believe, right? So we have some time now for discussion and questions. The floor is yours if you have a question. Yes.
One of the things as I was listening to how it peace built afterwards and hearing about the Truth Commission and some of the things that Dr. George Lopez said that comes to my mind is the torture that's being done, perpetrated by the United States isn't the same as in others in that it's not an entirely internal problem. It's a global and multinational issue. So for instance, things like electing people who've been victimized to leadership positions isn't much of an option for us. And I'm curious, I don't think there's much in the literature about a problem that this encompasses so many different nations. So I'm just curious how, when you're thinking about what comes next, how that plays out and how it's going to work on such a global level.
Do you want to take them one by one?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Yeah.
Okay. I wish I had a good answer to that. I don't. But the first and most critical one is this is what increases the need to know who did what to whom under what conditions and for us to trace the processes that developed. Because the extent and reach of this is unprecedented, is, as you say, global. How is it possible, or what deals were made with Bulgaria or Poland or others that they would be places where such secret renditions could occur? How is it possible that, given the thousands and 10,000s of people we incarcerated in Iraq, that our flow of refugees into the United States is so small? I don't want to eliminate the possibility yet that 25 years from now, there's a senator from one of our states who came here as a young Iraqi whose family was lost in one of these bitter struggles, maybe by a suicide bomber, maybe by an inadvertent American bombing, but had the experience of a broken country, that they may have come here to a second country and become an interesting witness about these issues.
Mary, anything to add?
Well, I do think it is important, as you pointed out, it is an international problem, and that there needs to be some accountability to each other as well, and that there does need to be leaders who are showing a way, who are willing to demonstrate responsibility and accountability.
Yes.
George, when you talk about the new torture paradigm and you talk about a construct and you talk about the logic of the construct, and it's pretty evident, that does all fit together. I'm just wondering if at this point you have, I don't know, I want to say evidence of a sort, either testimonies or orders, or etc. The idea that the torture, part of the purpose of the torture is to destroy the community, or at least to change the community to a more agreeable body of people. I don't dispute your logic. I just don't know that I've ever quite seen the kind of description that your construct would depend on.
This is why I would never have called on Peggy if I were you.
I'm just slowly journaling.
I think that's a very, very important question. We're trying to figure some of that out. I'm trying to look at some data that would support this. Let me tell you that one of the only places I've seen this sketched out by someone who's done some pretty good interviews is Michael Schwartz's book on Iraq. I should remember the title of this. Anybody help me here? Okay. But Michael Schwartz's book on Iraq has 2 chapters about Ramadi and Fallujah and the strategy there that I think meets a lot of this criteria. I've talked with some of the Indiana National Guard people who've come back from Afghanistan and Iraq, and one of the interesting themes that comes out of there is the importance of doing sweeps or roundups and questioning people and doing a little bit of intimidation, or maybe a little bit more than intimidation, or putting the fear of God into them that everybody's watching. This was elements short of torture, but clearly a kind of coercive strategy that I would say that when left to operate under other conditions, when it was unguarded, particularly in Iraq, was part of a strategy. But I think this is really a very important question, because there may be a place for social scientists like me to take a step back and say, gee, these patterns look like this to me, but at some point you've got to have some empirical evidence. I don't expect the empirical evidence to be a dictate from the Assistant Secretary of Defense, but I do expect that there can be enough routinization of the way that things unfold in a battle environment that journalists or social scientists or ethicists can look at something and say, you know what, this doesn't look right. This looks like this, whether you count the people or don't count the people.
Welcome.
Speaking of people who count.
Yeah, I would like just to add a little bit, because when you use the term a new paradigm, I thought that's not new.
Mm-hmm.
In my years of working with torture survivors, and especially in the 80s when they were Central Americans, and if you look at anthropologists who have done field work in Guatemala, they describe very well the culture of silence that grew out of the massacres that took place, the torture that was perpetrated in Guatemala. So I look to there as an example, one. And then two, if you look at, I can't remember his name, and I'm terrible with Rwandan names because there's too many consonants together, but one of the architects of the genocide stated they worked very hard and intentionally to get the community to take up machetes, because when it was over, they wanted the whole country to be guilty, to be implicated in the crime, so that it would be impossible to prosecute in a way.
Let me agree with this first part, because it's very important. By new torture paradigm, I mean for the United States. I don't mean for these other, but you're exactly right in terms of Central America.
I guess I don't want to prolong this, but I mean, part of the discussion we had earlier had to do with the connection or lack thereof between public policy makers and the effects of what was done in our name. And so I am always, that's the purpose of my name.
My next target, for example, for textual analysis is the new counterinsurgency manuals, because I believe this is critical to counterinsurgency and successful counterinsurgency. That is, that you take those who are sympathizers, not necessarily perpetrators of the violence against you, and you make sure you break the will of the sympathizers and send them back to the community. And they become the forces of resistance against the people who are perpetrating. So we'll see.
I see there are two questions that have been waiting right here, and then I'm going to suggest that Professor Casale
we can make a decision. I was wondering, do you want to do this this evening? Because we have a slot this evening, so the question would be whether we would shift it to this evening or...
Yeah, on the way here, in addition to being sidetracked to Pittsburgh, I also found out that my clients in Venezuela are facing an emergency we need to deal with tonight. So
you prefer
it's now or
Great.
whenever.
Excellent. Well, let's just let you catch your breath for one more minute and take these two questions, and then pass the microphone
I'd
to
like to piggyback actually on her question. And the pattern that I see, at least as far as being a military person that I see, is basically in World War II we had indiscriminate bombing of cities. In Vietnam we had carpet bombing. In Iraq we had pinpoint bombing. To me it's just the reverse of what you said. We're becoming much more destructive, not less.
Except in the selection of original targets out of the first Gulf War, they were supposed to be, in terms of surgical bombing, around 210 to 212. And it was very clear in the first 3 days, January 15th, 16th, and 17th of 1991, when we had absolute control of the skies, that pinpoint bombing moved to 470 targets and began to include civilian infrastructure, including water treatment facilities, electrical grids, and the like. So the dilemma of precision-guided munitions, meaning that when you aimed at the depot or aimed at the electrical plant, you hit it and not the children's school, is in fact considered an effective and just treatment of the problem of collateral damage. But let us remember, most of the civilians who died as a result of the first Gulf War died within the 2 years after it from diarrhea and other things that were a direct extension of that bombing.
Yes, in the back.
As a doctor survivor, I have also testimony to what the professor was saying. In Ethiopia, I read on the internet that 20 people were killed, tortured, killed, and their bodies were eaten by the hyena. It was a mind game. It was to intimidate the other people. And I was so shocked, and I made a phone call to my brother. And he said, "What are you talking about Harare? Our own cousin body was eaten by the hyena," he said. He was a military. As soon as about 3 generals and a couple hundred military personnel defected to Eritrea, the guy went back to, he was a military, he was not an officer after he is from the rank and file. He just understood what was going on, and then he went back to his birthplace. They killed him, and then they threw his body in the jungle. And it took them about a month to dress his clothes, his hair, and the bones. It's a mind game, it's a psychological, to intimidate the people psychologically.
Thank you. I'm going to take a moment now to welcome again and to introduce Professor Doug Cassell, who is the Professor of Law and Notre Dame's Presidential Fellow and Director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights at Notre Dame Law School, where he teaches courses on international human rights, including human rights law, including torture. Doug was legal advisor to the UN Commission on the Truth for El Salvador and has advised governments and non-governmental organizations on transitional justice issues in Ghana, Guatemala, Indonesia, Northern Ireland, Panama, and Peru. He co-chairs the International Committee of the Board of Directors of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and serves on the advisory committee of the Human Rights Center of the American Bar Association. Professor Cassell is a graduate of Yale College and Harvard Law School. Welcome. We're glad you made it.
Thank you, Marie. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to be here. It's wonderful to be, period. I do international human rights work. I fly on average 3 times a week over the last 20 years. This afternoon, as we were on our way, this morning, as we were on our way to Washington, in an American Airlines plane, the pilot came on and said, "We're having trouble with the landing gear. The attendants will show you all how to get in," he didn't say the word crash position, but that's what it was. Okay, you know, I guess everybody's got to have their day sometime. And as we landed in Pittsburgh, we all followed the instructions, wrapped our arms down beneath our thighs, stuck our head down, hoped for the best. The best happened. The plane landed. It didn't crash. They couldn't move it on the ground because the wheels wouldn't turn, so they had to get towed in. We caught a later flight. I didn't get to speak to Mary and George, so I just got a 30-second précis from George as to what you all have been talking about. Didn't get to change my clothes. I apologize. But I tell you all this not just because it's fresh in my mind, but because it brings to my mind, and perhaps to yours, the fragility of the human psyche, the common humanity that can be engaged even in a situation where there is some danger, but where you know the people around you are trying to protect you and help you. The pilots, the attendants were as comforting and professional as they could be. They were literally in the same plane with us. If we went down, they went down. And I know from common knowledge that the odds of a plane crashing in Pittsburgh, United States of America, are statistically very slim, even though Alison DeForge, the great Human Rights Watch expert on Rwanda, just died a month ago flying into the airport in Buffalo, New York. But even so, even surrounded by the odds, by comforting voices, by an aura of we'll do everything we can to protect you, everybody in the plane knew that this was not within human control. We all, I think, felt a sense, an uncommon sense of solidarity with each other. We were all reminded of the fragility of this phase of human life. Contrast that with the person who is picked up not by the airline ticket agent and the airline attendants and the airline pilots, but by the men driving in unmarked Land Rovers with tinted glass, who pick you up totally unexpectedly. You're not planning to take a trip when they pick you up off the streets. And they take you not to Washington, D.C., where you're intending to go, but to a destination you had no idea you were going to, and even when you get there, you don't know where you are. And when they bring you inside, they treat you roughly. Their voices are harsh. Pretty soon your clothes are off. You're stripped naked. You're threatened. You may be beaten up a bit. There may be dogs barking at you. You're asked questions that you have no idea why they're being asked, and less idea of what the answer is. And all of this before the real torture begins. For any of us who have not been a victim of torture, it must be very difficult to imagine the state of uncertainty, of fear, of insecurity, of no one is here to protect me. These people are here to harm me, maybe to kill me. I don't know when. I don't know how. I don't know why. International law on torture tells us that there's physical torture and there's psychological torture. But whenever there is physical torture, there is also psychological torture. I don't know how much Mary, who knows more about these things than I do, spoke about these issues, but the victims of torture suffer, in many cases, as was reported by the Second Truth Commission in Chile, the one that focused on torture and prolonged arbitrary detention. They interviewed people more than 20 years after they had been tortured by the Pinochet regime in the 73, 74, 75 period. And people, many of them, were still suffering severe psychological consequences as a result of what might have been only a couple of weeks or a few days, or in some cases even a few hours of the psychological torment that comes with torture. It's for that reason that in recognition of our common humanity, of whatever it is that might be sacred within us, for those of us who are people of faith, whatever it is of God that is inside us, that gradually, over the last couple of centuries, first the Western world and now the entire world has come to prohibit torture in law. There is an international treaty called the UN Convention Against Torture, one of many international human rights treaties that prohibits torture. It's been joined by something over 145 the last time I looked. It may have gone up a little bit since then. Nations in the world out of 192 member states of the United Nations. And this treaty, which has been in force since the 1980s and which has been joined, albeit with some unfortunate reservations, by the United States, not only prohibits torture, but it says it is an offense of a universal character. Wherever a torturer may be found, anywhere on the planet, the government which finds him or her has an obligation under the Torture Convention, not a right, not a license, not a legal authorization, an obligation under the Torture Convention to make sure that that person is brought to justice. And that can be done in one of two ways, either criminally prosecuting the person right then and there in that country, or extraditing the person to some other country that is prepared to prosecute the alleged perpetrator. That can result in things that at first glance surprise lay observers. Is it really the case that someone from, say, Egypt, who tortures someone from, say, Indonesia, can be prosecuted in a federal court a few blocks from this classroom, maybe a couple of miles, I guess? The answer is yes. It's a strange reach. What on earth does the federal court in Washington, D.C. have to do with what was done in Egypt by an Egyptian to an Indonesian? And the answer is that even the governments of the world became persuaded 20-some years ago that torture is such an evil that it cannot be allowed to go unpunished. And that wherever the torturer goes, just as the pirates of the 1600s were regarded as the enemies of all humanity, the torturer must not be allowed to escape justice. So saith the law. And yet, if we were to do a survey of all the perpetrators, of all the cases of torture whose victims have been treated by Mary and other members of the Kovler Center in Chicago, how many perpetrators would we be talking about over the years now, Mary? Thousands? Let's say arbitrarily it's 3,000. How many of those 3,000 do you think have actually been prosecuted? And we know the answer is very few. But history moves in stages. 2 or 3 centuries ago, torture was lawfully practiced in every capital of Europe. Around the same time and for centuries before, it was practiced openly by the church of which many of us are members. Before World War II, there was no international law prohibiting torture. Whoever lived in a given country was protected, if at all, only by the laws of that country. So if you were in Joseph Stalin's Russia, or Adolf Hitler's Germany, or you name it, if you got tortured, it was none of the world's business as far as the law was concerned. That's changed. Torture was prohibited with the very first human rights instruments that came out of World War II, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But even then, there was no obligation to bring torturers to justice. It was merely prohibited. Each country could decide for itself whether to enforce that prohibitory norm. It wasn't for another 40 years until the 1980s when it became the obligation of governments to prosecute. It will take more time until that obligation is made real and put into practice. But the progressive movement of the law and of public consciousness against torture is clearly moving in a single direction globally, as it should be. Even for nations which are not parties to the Convention Against Torture, international and national judges have increasingly ruled in their case law that torture is not only a violation of customary international law, so that it's a violation of human rights wherever it is committed, even in a country which has not joined any human rights treaties, but it also has the status of what is called in law, and I'm proud of this because it's one of the few Latin phrases I know, even though I'm a lawyer, it's called jus cogens, which means overriding law, peremptory law. It means that there is no law, there is no treaty which can ever authorize torture. Because if there were to be such a law or a treaty, that law or treaty would itself be a violation of fundamental international law. And yet history may have its overriding trends, even its jus cogens, but there are countercurrents. Always have been, always will be. We have just lived through 7.5 years of countercurrent. The evidence is now almost beyond dispute. I'm convinced. I think many of you would be convinced. I won't go so far to say as everyone would be convinced, so I'll call it almost beyond dispute, that some of the most senior officials in one of the world's oldest democracies, with one of the world's loudest and clearest claims to respect for civil liberty and human dignity, faced with a crisis, gripped by panic, ignorant of history, lacking in judgment, ill-advised by strident ideologues appointed to positions of authority in the Justice Department, authorized what must be called by its name, torture. All through this period, the President of the United States said, "We do not torture. The United States does not torture. We condemn torture." And yet, even as he was making these public statements, his senior advisors, at the very least, the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, the Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, the Vice President, Dick Cheney, and especially the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, as well as their lawyers, were well aware of what was being done to suspects that the United States had captured and believed to be connected with Al-Qaeda. How many of you saw the New York Times op-ed page this Sunday? Most people did not. It's a long op-ed in there by Mark Danner, terrific journalist and writer, defender of human rights over many years. Mr. Danner somehow got hold of a previously secret ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, report that was provided privately to the United States government. It contains descriptions by several prisoners of how they allege to have been treated. What's remarkable about the allegations is how similar they are, and yet these were people who had been isolated from each other for years in prison and interviewed separately in private by the Red Cross. Their treatment consisted of being thrown against brick walls, of having towels or cords wrapped around their neck and used to swing them around and bash them into walls as if they were some kind of a dangerous animal, of being stripped naked, kept awake for days on end, exposed to freezing temperatures, sweatbox temperatures, punched, kicked, and, oh yes, subjected to the technique that the previous Attorney General, Mr. Mukasey, was somehow unable to say whether, as a matter of law, it constituted torture, namely waterboarding. Try waterboarding yourself sometimes. Try it. Find yourself a nice incline, one of those lounge chairs that people have by the pool, and set it up so that you can be lying with your head down, your feet up, your face facing up. Put a wet washcloth over your face. Arrange for your best friend to tie your hands at your side, your feet to the lounge so that you can't possibly move or protect yourself. Strap your head down so you can't move it. Get that washcloth all soaked, and then just take the garden hose and start pouring water right into your mouth. It's not simulated drowning. It is actual drowning. Your lungs begin to fill. You are on your way to dying. Just before you go over the edge, but you don't know this while they're doing it, they stop it. That's torture. That's complete disrespect for the dignity of a human being. The previous government, the Bush administration, has admitted that they inflicted that technique, at the very least, on, at the very least, 3 individuals. Are the rest of their stories about being body slammed into walls, treated in all the other ways I've described, and they related to the ICRC, true? We don't know for sure, but if you're prepared to waterboard someone, you're probably prepared to do the rest. And according to reports, even though these torture sessions took place in countries like Poland and Thailand, in this world of modern communications, Donald Rumsfeld and others in Washington were literally being kept informed minute by minute as the techniques were being used, and were directing the interrogation from thousands of miles away. Do we know that? No. Is Donald Rumsfeld, like everyone else, entitled to a trial in a court of law to determine whether that's true? Of course he is. But these are the kinds of allegations that are out there. Allegations made by retired CIA, FBI, and military interrogators. Allegations also made by the prisoners themselves. Allegations that fit directly into the obligation under the Torture Convention of the country where these activities took place to investigate, and if the allegations are sustained after thorough investigation, to prosecute, and if the person is convicted, to proportional punishment that fits the crime. Now, there's not much stomach for that in the United States of America. People really don't want to be most people don't really want to be prosecuting Mr. Rumsfeld or Mr. Cheney or David Addington, the Vice President's lawyer, or anyone else. We're facing a different kind of crisis right now, and we all know it. An economic crisis. We have a new president who offers us hope with a new set of priorities on the economy, health, education. He himself has publicly said, even while rescinding the old Bush administration orders that allowed these things to happen and issuing new orders, making it absolutely clear no torture in the future. When asked about looking back, he has said, I prefer to look forward rather than backward. And so the proposal by Senator Patrick Leahy to create some sort of a truth commission to look at what it is our government did in our name over the last 7 years has at the moment no traction. Doesn't look as if it's going anywhere. H.R. 104, the bill proposed by Congressman John Conyers with dozens of co-sponsors, which would create a comprehensive truth commission to look at some of these questions, doesn't look as if it's going to get anywhere near a majority of the House. The Washington Post, a couple of days ago, many of you might have seen it if you're from Washington, published an editorial in the wake of Mr. Danner's revelations of the ICRC report and took a somewhat narrower approach than Leahy and Conyers and said, well, let's at least have a truth commission for torture. Let's at least find out what we did with regard to torture and not deal with the whole range of human rights abuses by the prior administration. Will that one do any better? Will that one garner any more support from the administration than the Leahy or Conyers proposals? We shall see. I doubt it. Will there be prosecutions? Well, Attorney General Holder said in his confirmation hearings, if someone relied in good faith on legal advice from the Justice Department, I don't think they should be prosecuted. Mr. Cheney, Mr. Rumsfeld had legal cover. They had these memos from John Yoo, brilliant young lawyer, professor at Berkeley Law School, saying that if the president acts as the commander-in-chief to win the so-called war against terrorism, he can do anything. Literally. Anything. Whatever he has to do to win the war, he has constitutional power to do. And no law passed by Congress, including the criminal statutes that make torture a crime, no treaty joined by the United States, including the Treaty Against Torture, and by implication, no Supreme Court decision either, can prevent the president from carrying out his constitutional duty to do what he thinks he must do. Translation: torture is constitutional. And if the president authorizes it, it's okay. Leon Panetta, when he was confirmed as CIA director, and Dawn Johnson, in the course of becoming the new head of the Office of Legal Counsel of the Justice Department, have said the same sort of thing. People who relied on these bogus legal opinions from John Yoo are in effect immunized from prosecution. So who do we prosecute? Do we prosecute John Yoo, maybe? After all, the Nazi lawyers after World War II were prosecuted for advising the Nazi government that it could commit various forms of mayhem. I have reservations about that. I'm a lawyer. I give advice. I give advice to clients in areas of the law where there is some uncertainty. If I thought I could be prosecuted for giving legal advice, I would have some hesitation about being a creative lawyer. Particularly if I expressed a legal opinion in good faith. I would think it would be, in almost all circumstances, unfair to prosecute me. And John Yoo, who I have met and debated, has always said publicly, I don't know what he said in those private meetings, but he's always said publicly, I wasn't advocating torture. I was merely giving legal advice. They asked me what they could and could not do, and I gave them the answer the law provides. I didn't say they should do it. We shall see. The Office of Professional Responsibility of the Justice Department, OPR, has been conducting an investigation of Mr. Yoo, in which they reportedly have had access to a large number of internal emails, and there are allegations that the legal advice was not given in good faith, but was rather given to give the client the green light to do what the client wanted to do anyway. Who knows if that is true? It's reported that the OPR investigation, or some portions of it, will be made public in the next few weeks. Perhaps then we shall see. Why isn't there more outrage? Why isn't there more clamor for justice in the United States? Why aren't we like Chile, where there are now literally hundreds of mid and senior military officers in prison for torture and murder, and hundreds more still on trial for acts committed a quarter of a century ago? More than that now. Well, in part, it's because of who the victims were. If you're like me, an American citizen, your chances of having been waterboarded by the Bush administration are pretty close to zero. They picked their targets in a politically intelligent way, and nobody can ever accuse the Bush administration of having been politically dumb. They were all, as far as we know, foreign citizens. The torture was committed, as far as we know, outside the boundaries of the 50 United States. It was committed in places to which no one had access. The press couldn't go there. Congressional delegations were only shown the sunny side of the street when they went to Guantanamo. At Guantanamo, only the ICRC had access, and the ICRC's modus operandi is to provide private confidential reports to governments. It's only now that we're finding out, years after the fact, and only through some leak, what the ICRC was telling the Bush administration years ago. And beyond Guantanamo, there were the CIA's black sites, the secret prisons where not even the ICRC had access. No one had access. For years, people were held in these sites while the government refused to acknowledge even the existence of the sites, let alone the fact that a particular detainee might be in one of them. And so when you conduct torture against people who are not part of the domestic political constituency, and you do it in the dark of night and far away, you may succeed in minimizing the extent of press coverage, of public and congressional concern. And so when it finally does come to light what you've done, at least in part from what we already know, senators and congressmen can propose investigations and inquiries, but there's not much public demand to back them up. The torture treaty may say it must be done. The political feeling of the moment does not support that. This is not new. The United States is not the only country to have faced this kind of question. Every time you go from a regime which engages in systematic and gross violations of human rights to a new, more democratic regime, small d democratic, these debates take place. In El Salvador, they just had an election a couple of days ago, and Mauricio Funes, for the first time, led the FMLN to the presidency in El Salvador. And the victims of the atrocities committed by the Salvadoran military and the death squads during the period of the 1970s into the early 1990s, some of them have continued to call for justice to be done, for the truth to be investigated and told. And yet Mr. Funes, who is a very good man, I've had the pleasure of meeting him, basically says what Barack Obama says. We've got to move forward, not backward. We don't want to be divisive. These are political realities. And yet all of us who think that the effort to bring an end to this blight on humanity requires the serious pursuit of, at minimum, the truth and also justice, need to reflect on whether we're prepared to sit back and let this country be one more country in a long line that says when torture comes to light, we prefer to look forward, not back. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Do we have a few minutes for some questions? I know it's 5:30. A couple minutes? Okay. Okay, let's just take a few minutes to have a little bit of interaction. Mary or George, would you like to ask a question or make a comment? No, okay. All right. Fine. Dave, and then...
A couple questions. One, first is for Mary. I was was wondering if you worked with perpetrators as well in the torturers, and if you could comment on any of that effects that.
That's somebody else's specialty.
And the other was it's about a survey that I haven't actually seen, but a friend of mine told me about it maybe 2 or 3 years ago. There was a survey. He said there was a survey of here in the U.S. on whether you think torture is okay, and divided by religion, and it said that Catholics were most supportive about that. Have you guys seen that survey? And if that's true, what your opinions on why you think Catholics would support torture more than other religions?
They were tortured in grammar school?
There's somebody here who knows the data. It's something like 63%, isn't it? Or,
63% according to the Pew data.
Pew data, yeah.
And the Pew poll from 2006 shows that 75% of Catholics think in some circumstances torture is justified. And as far as I could tell the other day when I went looking, they conducted this again in 2009, February, and the overall figure, 63% for all Americans, was the same, but I couldn't find any separate anything for Catholics.
There is another survey that we might bear in mind, and that is, for what it's worth, USA Today, I think it was February 7th, it was early February of this year, did a survey, a nationwide survey with a fairly substantial sample, asking the question, do you think there should be an investigation of the allegations that various acts were committed by the Bush administration, including torture? And the answer was something in the neighborhood of 2/3 of the respondents said that there should be an investigation to find out if torture was committed, and if so, to determine by whom. So while there has long been support for torture, at least where people are given the ticking bomb scenario or something like that, I think there's also some evidence, at least in this survey, of a broad recognition by Americans that at the very least, if torture is committed, you've got to investigate it, and perhaps if they were asked, they would say, well, I want to know if it was really justified in that particular case, but at least there should be an investigation. So there is some indication that if the Congress or the President were to proceed with investigations, there would be majority support in the public. Prosecutions, I think, would be a different matter.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Grace, and I come from East Africa. I'm a survivor of torture. My question straight away go to Dr. Mary. She was giving a life testimony and a study done in Rwanda, which happened to be in East Africa, where I come from. I would just want to say that I would request you to give the picture of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because I know it is there in Rwanda. These people need to know what exactly is happening in this Truth and Reconciliation, because in my country, where I come from, which is Uganda, we also have a similar situation. You know, yesterday I was watching on the YouTube, and they call it the silent war. We have an internal war that has been going on for the last 20 years. But it is within us, the Ugandans, and we've been calling the international community, please come, please come. Nobody is coming. This war has created a lot of problems. People have been tortured. If you see the people who come from northern Uganda, in the same country where I was coming from, their stories are terrible. Some of them have no lips. Others are children. They don't know where their parents were. They don't know where they went. It's a cancer that Dr. George was talking about. And lastly, I would also want you to talk about the cancer, because you did the study in Rwanda. What happened in Rwanda was a cancer. And this cancer is continuous. Because as I speak, most of Rwandese I know were in my country. Most of them are born in my country. And when they try to go back home, the situation has never changed. It is almost the same. So the cancer is still eating up. So this is what I want you to throw more light on and how we can go about that.
I do, thank you. I think that it's a complicated issue, which I think all our presentations reflect, panel 1, panel 2. And I think the issue is there is this need for truth, but if it's truth with impunity or accountability, it creates problems. So in Rwanda, because of the numbers of perpetrators that needed to be prosecuted, there was the International Court in Arusha, but additionally they created community courts, gachachas, which is a traditional form of court, where communities created little tribunals. Now, this was a traditional court in the sense that it was used historically to settle land disputes, marital problems. Suddenly, this structure is being asked to hear war crimes of genocide. The issue is that they also had no authority to punish. And so many perpetrators, after they agree to appear before the tribunal, describe what they have done, tell where bodies are buried so that funerals can take place, which is very important to healing, the perpetrators are back in their communities. And so there is a lot of distress that we see in the program that I'm consulting and training providers, is that there is this level of ongoing distress, which showed up in our research, because on a daily basis people are living next door to, confronting the person that they either witnessed commit the crime or heard in their testimony about the atrocities they committed. The other issue that I think you want me to address is that so people admitted what they did and you can find bodies, but these same victims are confronting their perpetrators and they're living in very desperate situations. The level of hunger that exists for the most of the population is very severe. We started in 2005, we asked people how often they were eating, and pretty much it was once a month. I mean, not once a month, once a day. Staple in Rwanda are potatoes. So people were frequently eating potatoes on a daily basis. Last year, we started seeing a decline in how often people were eating. That it's every other day, every third day, that family they're creating eating schedules and rotating on who gets to eat. I think these conditions of poverty, which are not giving people, the theme we've been talking about is integrity and dignity and respect as a human being, are not being provided for the population that suffered. Whether it's living in exile or if you were in the country, there is a disparate level in the quality of life and the outcome. And I think that is something that has to be addressed in any post-conflict situation when you're trying to do restitution. It isn't just, I mean, I totally agree that it's important to have truth be told, but that doesn't give people back their dignity. And I think Rwanda is an example where people have not been given their dignity back.
Thank you. Any last word, Dr. George?
Last word sounds ominous, but I wish you all well.
I think we're probably just about at time to break for supper. Thank you very much, and thanks to our panelists.
Everyone here in a few minutes.